Let me go now to Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee. He was one of the folks that questioned the former special counsel yesterday. And he's somebody that is not yet ready to say, you know what, time for an impeachment inquiry. Congressman, good to see you. And I want to get, because you are one of the few Democrats that seem to also want to do some accountability with Mr. Mueller. But let me start with this impeachment question. Where are you?
Yeah, where I am is I want the president removed from office. So the question is what's going to work? And I don't think that's an academic question. So right now, because the Republican Party is morally bankrupt on this subject, that's the point, Adam Schiff is making. Impeachment is unlikely to be fruitful or productive in terms of removing the president from office. By the way, I don't think that's making it a political question. I think it's making an efficacy question. You want him held accountable. How do you do it? The Mueller report is an important step in doing that, and getting it out publicly is critical because we need to know what happened, and the American public needs to know who they've got in the Oval Office.
I guess the question is this. If you don't do it, what are the unintended consequences? For instance, if you choose not to impeach him and he wins re-election, regret?
Well, can we make one thing clear, that the House, impeaching the president has nothing to do ultimately with removing him. There's going to have to be a trial in the Senate.
But isn't that the point?
But let's
don't
make
you
that
need
clear.
to lay out the case? I guess the reason I say it here is, to me, what was missing yesterday, the most dynamic part of the Mueller report is when they start putting the timelines together. As this happened at Trump Tower, this was happening with the Russian hackers, and we didn't see any of that yesterday. An impeachment inquiry, we would.
Well, if your point is that we're not doing everything we can to get out those facts to the American public, I guess I disagree. And if your point is that would be more effective in an impeachment inquiry, which, by the way, is equally likely to become a partisan circus, more akin to the Brett Kavanaugh hearings than a fact-finding exercise, I think that's worth examining as well. Bottom line is that we do have an election in a year. The American public's going to get to decide whether we hold this president accountable in the most effective way possible, which is democratically removing him. And I do think it's relevant to ask what is likely to work. Now, by the way, I don't want to mince words. If you ask me whether the president deserves impeachment, yeah, he does. What he did was outrageous, unpatriotic, unethical, fill in the blank. And I think part of having Mueller up here is to lay that out chapter and verse. The problem with impeachment is everybody goes to the red team, blue team, DEFCON 1, and it's unlikely to be productive in terms of continuing to get the facts out and persuading Americans about why we need to take the country in a different direction. All
right, I want to go a little bit to one of the specific areas you questioned Robert Mueller on, and it was on the issue of interviewing the president. Let me play the clip first.
We were almost towards the end of our investigation, and we'd had little success in pushing to get the interview of the president. We decided that we did not want to exercise the subpoena powers because of the necessity of expediting the end of the investigation.
What did you think of the president's written responses, Mr. Mueller?
It's certainly not as useful as the interview would be.
In fact, you pointed out, and by my count, there were more than 30 times when the president said he didn't recall, he didn't remember, no independent recollection, no current recollection. And I take it by your answer that it wasn't as helpful. That's why you used words like incomplete, imprecise, inadequate, insufficient. Is that a fair summary of what you thought of those written answers?
That is a fair summary. And I presume that comes from the report.
And yet, sir, and I ask this respectfully, by the way, the president didn't ever claim the Fifth Amendment, did he?
I'm not going to talk to that.
All right, I want to know, what were you going to ask respectively? It sounds like you think Mueller didn't do, that you are second-guessing Mueller's decision not to subpoena the president.
You better believe I am. I think it was a mistake, but I think it's important what he said. What he said was that they were balancing. In fact, he did this with his hands. And what he was trying to convey is that they were building what he called in the report significant and substantial evidence of the president's intent to obstruct justice. And he was balancing what they already had with the delay required to possibly get more through an in-person interview. I still wish he had put the president in a chair, sworn him in, and made him him answer some tough questions. I think we'll always wish that had happened. But the director's point is worth listening to. He said, page 13, volume 2, and look at appendix C to the whole report. He said very clearly, they believe there was sufficient and substantial evidence of the president's intent. And so I think what he's trying to say is, we already had it.
You know, it's interesting there. What Mueller is saying about subpoenaing the president in time is sort of the same argument being made about impeachment versus no impeachment versus the 2020 election. Fair?
You know, I think it's a little different. I think what he's saying is that, well, look, he could be forgiven for thinking that when he sent the report up to the attorney general that the guy would take it seriously and not go out and lie about it and dissemble and delay, and that the Congress might actually take it seriously, too, in both parties, which would be great. Because I think Bob Mueller comes from a different era when we used to take this stuff more seriously despite our partisan differences. And I have to tell you, so I am regretful that he didn't subpoena the president, but I am very respectful of that person who came up and testified yesterday. I want my kids to grow up to be like Bob Mueller, and I hope I still hope we're generating guys like Bob Mueller who would take more seriously, despite their political affiliations, the kinds of findings he has in that report.
Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, Democrat from New York, thanks for coming on and sharing your views. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.